Welcome to Busy Research, the podcast where business meets data and insights drive success. I'm your host, Vicki McCarthy, Director of the Center for Applied Business Research at Austin Peay State University. On this podcast, we get busy learning about how applied business research can improve business decision-making. Welcome to another episode of Busy Research. Today, we're diving into a hot topic in Clarksville, Tennessee, hotel motel taxes. What's the buzz all about? Dr. Tim Self, an associate professor of hospitality management at Austin Peay State University, is here to tell us. Dr. Self's current research delves into the impact of increasing city, motel, hotel taxes on tourism. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's start with the basics. What exactly is a hotel motel tax and why do cities implement it?
Sure. It's a great question. Sometimes the hotel lodging tax is placed on each night's stay at a hotel. And a lot of times these are called a tourist tax, a room tax, a bed tax, sales tax, or a hotel occupancy tax or a hot tax. Sometimes that's referred to, and they're charged as a percentage of the room rate rather than a flat fee. So because of that, they can generate quite a bit of revenue for a city. Most of the lodging taxes are used for general fund purposes, to promote a convention center or tourism, or to finance public facilities such as convention centers and whatnot, and to promote tourism generally for the local area.
Well, what are some reasons that cities might want to implement or decide to raise their hotel motel taxes?
Sure. It's created as a way to increase government revenues. So instead of increasing taxes on local residents, such as increasing property taxes, state and local governments turn to essentially the non-voters of the area. And while a lot of the tax may fall on travelers, some of the burden of the tax is shared by both the providers of the lodging accommodations and their guests. A lodging tax raises the room rate, and depending on the supply and demand of the area, the hotel manager might not be able to increase rates to the full amount of the tax. Ultimately, the guests generally pay about 86% of the total of the tax, of the increase of the tax, and about 14 or 15% is typically absorbed by the industry, either by lowering their room rates or reduced occupancy.
And you touched on this a little bit in terms of the industry being affected by these taxes, but how does it affect local tourism?
Good question. So it really, the tax can vary city to city and even neighborhood to neighborhood. And it's somewhat of so like a larger city like Los Angeles could actually have multiple different tax rates depending on the area. So if you raise taxes too high, you can make a destination less attractive for larger event booking or price sensitive groups. For this reason, cities are sometimes cautious to increase taxes for out-of-state travelers. And some of the studies show that sensitivity to lodging taxes depend on the area the tourist is visiting, whether there's hotels of the same class or status or with similar amenities in neighboring areas or closer to cities that might have lower lodging taxes. So in that sense, the hotel tax could hurt the hotels in that area that have the higher tax rate, especially for those businesses that their main business is hosting conventions and business travelers. Hotels in those areas with higher tax rates may find it necessary to lower their room rates to remain competitive. And on the other hand, hotels may be able to absorb some of this tax with little impact to their business. So it really depends on the amount that is done and kind of the area where the hotel is located at is depending on how much of an impact the industry locally.
Do you have any examples of cities that have successfully raised their hotel motel taxes without negatively impacting tourism?
Sure. I mean, one of the larger areas would be Las Vegas. And just because they they used a lot of their taxes to promote to promote Las Vegas, which they're very successful at doing, and to invest into convention centers. I think New York City, Los Angeles, they've done it, and many business travelers can absorb that cost because that's where they want to do business. Chicago is another one. Because the tax is something that hotels can't control, generally their coping strategy is to make sure that the consumer is educated, to make sure on the billing that the taxes are very clear, that the consumer understands that the hotels have no control over the rates. I should say the hotels have control over the rates, but not the taxes. So they don't get blamed when they see a potentially larger rate. It really kind of, the ones that do it better, I think, from a lot of the research shows that if the money is used to invest back into hospitality and tourism, either through promoting or convention centers or to increase other facilities, that generally the industry itself then tends to be more open to it than if they don't. Unless it goes to something else, then they tend to be a little bit more hesitant toward it. So yeah, I think the ones that do well, the industry typically gets upset for a little bit. But again, as long as the money is being used to go back to the industry, it tends to be more acceptable for it.
So I'm curious. So you mentioned cities like Chicago and Las Vegas, and like you said, when you can see as a consumer, when I stay in a hotel and I've looked at my bill and I can see, okay, here's these are the taxes on top of the rate, it's the state tax and then the local tax, et cetera. But how do you know, like, which of these cities are reinvesting those taxes into tourism, where it is making it more palatable for the hospitality industry?
That's a good question. You'd really have to do more digging into it. Chicago, for example, the research I've looked at, they actually use it to help pay some of the pensions for the area. So it's not directly related to tourism. So it'd be something that you as a consumer would have to dig into to see what it's being used to. And to do that, I mean, in the state of Nevada, their tourist tax or hotel tax, whatever you want to call it, allows that state not to pay for, there's no income tax in that state because it relies, heavily on tourism. But because of that, you are more susceptible to budgetary problems if if the tourism stops. So like during 2020 around COVID, the state of Nevada, had some budgetary issues that it had to address when tourism went down. So relying too much on it can cause problems if it's used outside of just tourism or marketing or to convention centers.
Well, that's a good point and a good example. I'm curious if you think personally that if a city implementing a new local tax were to provide that information and be very transparent to consumers that the city tax is going towards tourism or marketing or where it's going, if you think that might make a difference.
There are some research that does suggest that if tourists are aware of it, I mean, I think at the end of the day, nobody wants to pay more money. Nobody wants to be taxed more. Or if you think your bill is going to be $100 and it ends up being, 20% more, 17% more, it's usually people aren't happy about that. But it's trying to find the fine line between where that's going to discourage you from visiting the location, or is that's just the price to pay. There were some studies that looked at Maine, for instance, and their tourism, and they found that, some people were more price sensitive, but it was people who were repeat customers, but new customers didn't really know any better. So that's the price of doing it. Whereas, Maine, some tour groups were more sensitive to the tax increase. And so they might move to stay at, areas outside of those taxes to save some money. And some of these go up quite a bit. And but it also, like in Chicago, their current tax rate is around, it's 17.4%. And they've had two increases in the last 6 years. And the most recent one was just a 1% in 2016. And it generated $474 million of extra income yearly, which was mostly earmarked for government worker pension costs. So that created some tensions with the industry because it wasn't going back to tourism. And then Cincinnati, the lodging tax increased in 2013 from 8.2% to 11.7%. But that was to cover the cost of two convention centers in the state or in the area. But they're hoping that people will want to still come there, and now you're giving them a reason to come. Now you have two convention centers, and that they're going to come. So, yeah, it's a really fine line that I think communities in the industry are trying to walk, as far as we want these, like here in Clarksville, the increase was proposed at 4%, but it was agreed on 2.75% increase, which puts it a little over 20%. And that doesn't go into effect till January 1 of next year, but it's to help convert the Roxy Regional Theater into a performing arts center. So instead of increasing taxes on the local citizens, it's to, and they want to update this and create a performing arts center downtown in Clarksville, which is great. And I think the community will really like that. It's, I think locally for politicians is to, you're not increasing the tax base, but you're potentially discouraging people from visiting. And I think that's the fine line that communities really have to balance to make it, you don't want to, you're punishing potentially one industry to pay for these things.
Well, and you provide two very good examples of cities being able to generate more revenue based on their taxes, with Chicago and Cincinnati for two different pots of money.
Right.
But do you have an example or any examples of where raising or implementing a hotel motel tax has backfired on a city?
It's hard to say if it's backfired. There's some research that does suggest that they in the short term potentially could lose some visitors because they're more price sensitive. If there's, like I said earlier, that there's some equal or similar markets that offer similar amenities and hotels that are cheaper. And so there was one research that showed Huntsville, which increased their tax from 13 to 15%, this goes to help expand their visitor or their convention center, excuse me. But they did show statistically that there was a bit of an impact on people choosing that to visit Huntsville because of those costs. So I don't know if necessarily backfired, but there has been some research that shows that more price sensitive groups might be discouraged to go there if they can find an alternative. I mean, maybe a backfire, you could almost say Las Vegas, when it relies so heavily on tourism tax that when you have a economic shutdown like COVID, that there's a weakness there. But I think, again, you don't want to discourage the industry or to grow. New York City did raise it at one point, and then by lowering so some places have lowered it. By lowering it, that increased revenues because more people were able to come. So again, there's a lot of mixed research on how much of an impact that raising it has, but it's a very concern because some people will be discouraged if it's too high. And here in Clarksville, we also have military, so there's that aspect that it might impact them as they come through here.
Well, it's definitely a fascinating and complex topic when we talk about cities raising any taxes at all, raising taxes. But
Sure.
When it's on one industry, when they're looking for, to make significant improvements and different pots of money.
Right.
So what advice do you have, or do you have any advice that you might give city officials when they're considering implementing a new hotel motel tax or raising a tax?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it's you've got this budgetary, it's political, it's an economic issue, and I think it's important for officials to benchmark what other similar cities in the area, what their tax rates are. I think being clear to the community, even the tourists, what this tax is going toward, and making sure that you have the industries, that they're on board with what you're trying to do, and you're sensitive, and you're understanding that increasing it too much could and will potentially discourage the guests you have, and then if you keep it lower, you can create more demand and get the tax that way. So I think it's just being really smart about not only educating people where this money is going to go and having a clear path of what it's going to be used for, and then looking at the comparable cities that and kind of where the current city matches up to make sure that it's not enough that it would be push people away from staying at your place over because of a tax, and not get too greedy to do that. So.
Right. Well, and great advice, Tim. I think that, like you said, it's a lot to consider and weigh for any city official or locality. So before we wrap up, is there anything else that you think our listeners should know about the future of hotel motel taxes and tourism?
I think with the issue, it's just to be aware of what your local city or state are looking to use this money for, and to understand that this is just something that I think as communities look to either promote themselves, to expand convention centers, or to go to different facilities. That one way to do that is to look at to go with people who aren't voting for them, and so they to rely on tourism. But again, it could be something that impacts the industry itself, and it's a fascinating one because it's constantly changing, and it's one that we all experience, because while it might be beneficial for your local community, the next time you travel, you're going to be the one having to pay that extra 2 or 3%, and it might not be as fun. So I think it's just an interesting one that it could benefit you, but then also we're all going to eventually run into it. So it's just a constant thing that it impacts every city, every state, kind of runs into this. So it's a really interesting one to kind of follow.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Tim. Your insights here on this topic have been incredibly valuable for myself, and I'm sure our listeners too, because like you said, we're being in localities where we may be benefiting from the extra local revenues versus also out traveling and having to pay those extra taxes. So I appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Busy Research. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next episode of Busy Research. Until then, stay curious and stay busy.